Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Reyes-Fournier, and welcome to the wrap-up of week 3, where we're discussing existential therapy versus person-centered therapy. I don't like the fact that they're saying versus, because these are two therapies that work very well together. One of the things that, since we started with Carl Rogers last week, we'll keep going with Carl Rogers right now, and then we'll move over to existential therapy in a second. One of the things that we always need to remember about Carl Rogers is that he believed in that healthy people are aware of their behavior. In that belief, and also based on the people that he liked, here is one of them. One of the philosophers that he tends to quote a lot in his work is Soren Kierkegaard, who was basically the father of existentialism. So, in many ways, person-centered therapy is rooted in existential philosophy. And I'm going to remind you once again that psychology in general is rooted in philosophy. And you would do well if you were to spend a little time reading about these different philosophies. Why? Because at the end of the day, most of the theories you're going to come up against or read about are going to be based in a lot of the work done before. So, for example, when I was working on my dissertation, I read a whole lot of Aristotle. I didn't do my dissertation in something BC. I did my dissertation in the 2000s. So that work is still very real because we're still talking about human beings and human behavior and human motivation. And who better to go to than the philosophers who basically spend their lives thinking about that. So Soren Kierkegaard basically spent his life focusing on, what life was about and looking at how we should live our life, or we ought to live our lives. Now, notice how I said that we ought to live our lives like that. Now, when we get into Albert Ellis, you're going to see where the problem is on that. He believed that life was subjective. So in other words, you make your own rules about how you're going to live your life and what the rules are to how you live your life. Okay? Those are two separate things. You say how you want, what you want in your life and how you want to live your life. And those are the rules that you have to go by. And these are important aspects because when you look at the things that we do in existential therapy, that really comes into play. They talk about the act of living as something being very intense and courageous. And that is something that the therapist in existential therapy needs to remember and needs to embrace. It's not, I'm sorry, something just fell behind me. So the idea is living a very present and courageous life based on how you feel about things. Now, don't worry, I will be giving you all these things so you could read it. And of course, you're sitting there thinking, I don't want to do that. But I really would recommend it. When I was an undergrad, I didn't care for things like, don't tell me about the history and systems of psychology. Just tell me what's going on now. Let me just, move forward. But the reality is that, we're so rooted in our history that you need to know everything. I mean, even now with positive psychology, all of these therapies that we're discussing in the last couple of weeks are coming back with a vengeance. So knowing these things is very important. Drink a little coffee, and here we go. Existential therapy. The father of existential therapy is Rollo May. You would actually like reading Rollo May. His writings are very beautiful, very, very philosophical in nature. but he had a very nice way of writing. Also, one of my favorite writers, and actually what we would call the father of group therapy, is Irving Yalom, who has several books on group therapy, and probably if you take a class on group therapy, you're going to end up reading a book by Yalom. He believed there was 4 major themes in life: death, freedom, responsibility, isolation, and meaninglessness. Now, that sounds really just horrible, but the reality is that these are all things that we all come up against during our lifetime, and it is up to us to figure it out. Our primary existence is for us to figure these things out. Whether we like to think about death or not, we think about death. Whether we like to feel alone or not, we think about these things. So thinking about isolation and thinking about meaninglessness brings us then to the case of Glenda. Glenda is feeling, I bristle at this word, had her own vacancy and superficiality. Vacancy. Easier to say emptiness than vacancy. Actually, vacancy makes it sound like somebody can come into it. And in these 2 therapies, especially existentialism, in existentialism, you have to fill in your own vacancy. And this is one of the reasons why both of these therapies would actually be very good for Glenda, mainly because she needs to be able to fulfill her own needs. And that meaninglessness that she's feeling is coming from the fact that she does not feel enough to fill herself up. Okay? Now, you're wondering, how did I figure that out? Well, that's really the bottom line for everything, isn't it? Because if we can get the client to be strong enough to fulfill their own needs and not have to look for the fulfillment outside of themselves, then they would be living a pretty healthy existence. So in Glenda's case, you're also thrown in for a loop because Glenda comes with a large societal baggage thing, because Glenda has had many partners and she feels, guilty, maybe some shame about having so many partners. One of the things, and I'm trying to see, here it is. One of the things that we need to remember, and especially when we're looking at both person-centered and existential therapy, the role of the therapist is to be somebody who works with the client. We are there to facilitate their understanding. To do that, we need to be supportive in a way that maybe some of you have never experienced, okay? That unconditional support comes from an unconditional understanding and acceptance. We need to be very wary of the fact that we come in with our own biases and our own stuff based on our beliefs that we've created throughout our lifetime. And a lot of these beliefs were created before we were even 10 years old. So, talking about a woman who's had many partners, if that brings up any kind of to you, you need to examine yourself. Right here it says the role of the existential therapist is really to facilitate the client's own encounter with himself, to work alongside him in the job of exploring and understanding better his values, assumptions, and ideals. Existential counseling places great emphasis on the therapist's responsibility to be aware of and to question her own biases and prejudices. If we are not constantly looking at ourselves and working on ourselves and checking in on our own biases and understandings of the world and prejudices of the world, then we cannot serve our clients. And to be able to do that, we need to go in through our own therapies and look at ourselves in a very stark manner. It's like, if you can't work with somebody who by societal standards is, loose or slut or a whore or any of the nasty words that we use for people like that, then you shouldn't do it. You shouldn't take clients like that. And quite frankly, you probably shouldn't practice either person-centered or existentialism, because you need to be clear with yourself. It's like if you look at the way that Carl Rogers talks about who he is in therapy, he's talking about his own feelings. When he's talking about the video that I showed you about him working with a South African soldier, he's talking about, can I do this? Can I actually, work with somebody like that? So yes, the way that, I'm sorry, got interrupted real quick. So the way he talks about his experience with the South African soldier is the way that every counselor who does either one of these practices, either existential or client-centered, they need to be willing to ask themselves these questions. Can I work with these people? When I was doing therapy on the regular, I used to work with, sex offenders. And when I started that work, I had to seriously consider how I felt about these things, how, as a woman sitting in a room with all these men who were pedophiles and rapists, and, how I can serve them if I thought they were, horrible people. And I came to the realization that, one, I couldn't serve them, and two, that whatever it is that they were, that at some point in their lives, they had to be damaged. Because, unless we were talking about sociopaths and psychopaths, which usually you don't end up with in therapy, that these people needed somebody to listen to them. And I challenged myself to do that. I worked with sex offenders for about 10 years in my career, and I could honestly say I really loved working with them because I learned so much about myself, and I dealt with so many things of my own, understanding about sex and growing up and learning about sex and things like that, that I consider that probably the largest growth I ever did as a psychotherapist. But that growth only came from being willing to say, I have issues here and I need to deal with these issues because I cannot serve these people if I don't deal with these issues. So in many ways, my foundation, like I've said before, is client-centered and existential because I'm willing to do that. Now, we're going to go through therapies where you don't have to do those kind of things. But at the end of the day, if you want to be able to sleep well at night for what with the work that you do, and to be able to say that you really help people, I cannot stress enough that you need to look at yourself and your own biases and prejudices and preconceptions of what people like that are, because we're usually wrong, and those beliefs are pretty much created by an 8-year-old kid who doesn't understand the world anyway. Okay, so some of you did a great job this week. Check out the All-Stars, and you're turning in the milestone, and I will get those back to you by Tuesday the latest. And what else? That is it. If you have any questions or concerns, please email me, shoot me a text, whatever you need. I am here to facilitate your success in this class. So have a wonderful week, people, and we'll talk soon.